It's the end of the legislative session, with the clock ticking down to July 31st. And among the absolute crush of bills headed toward the finish line is a sweeping climate bill just passed by the Massachusetts State Senate. But among all the items being cheered by climate advocates, there's also something very specific missing. I'm Jennifer Smith, and you're listening to the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's weekly podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Rusty Polsgrove, environmental justice organizer with Arise for Social Justice, and John Walkey, director of climate justice and waterfront initiatives with Greenroots. We're talking about environmental justice communities today. Arise and Greenroots are part of a nonprofit coalition, the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Legislative Table, which is concerned that the Senate bill leaves out a key definition of environmental justice communities that would make it easier to offer targeted regulations and relief at areas and populations that find themselves disproportionately impacted by damaging climate policy. So, let's get into it. Rusty and John, thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having us.
So the climate bill passed by the Massachusetts Senate is packed with policy areas we've talked about on this podcast before. Some that come to mind are banning competitive electric suppliers, geothermal projects, looking at the carbon footprint of state-owned properties. We got bottle bill updates. We got plastic bag and straw restrictions. We got changes to renewable energy permitting timelines. There's a lot in there. So we're going to spend the bulk of this episode talking about specific language that didn't make it in, but can we start with sort of the bill as a whole? Maybe starting with Rusty, how are your organizations feeling about the trajectory of climate legislation at the moment, in sort of a broad sense?
We're feeling challenged for sure. In this past session, a lot of what we've seen is the removal of the environmental justice populations definition from a lot of what's been put forward. That specifically has been really disappointing because this definition that was put forward in 2018 by the state legislation was meant to be used in our new legislation to make sure that we are protecting really vulnerable and marginalized groups that have been left out in the past. And so it's been upsetting to see that that has not made it through the Senate through this session.
And then, John, how are things looking over at Greenroots?
In a similar fashion, if I was speaking just as someone that worked at an environmental group, I'd be relatively happy with everything in there. But I work at an environmental justice organization. So there's a lot of aspects of legislation that we were excited about that didn't make it through the sausage making process, and it's been left behind. But there are some things, an intervener fund was put in there. Some of the things we discussed, the governor had convened a commission on energy siting reform. And some of those conversations have resulted in language that's in there. So there's a few little gems in the ashes, but most of what we were really pushing for just didn't really make it through.
Okay, so we are looking for the words in this climate bill, environmental justice communities, as defined by prior legislation, prior advocacy works. Give me the kind of basic answer here. Why are we looking for those words? What's specific about that community designation?
Well, as Rusty has mentioned, it's the folks who are hit first and worst when it comes to environmental impacts. And now with climate change, a lot of climate change impacts. So we're talking about low-income communities, communities of color, communities that the quintessential example of this sort of systemic racism, systemic sort of negative is the process of like redlining, where very bluntly, the federal government would say, what percentage of the population was Black only? They weren't using that term. And that the community was literally, there was a field that said infiltration of, and they would put Jewish, Italian, or whatever. And that systemic sort of racism is something that's reflected in the disinvestment over the intervening decades, which is now we see in terms of low urban tree canopy cover, which contributes to urban heat island effects, which contributes to very negative health outcomes. So it's really kind of a Rube Goldberg machine of cascading effects that go all the way back to just some really bad policy making in the past. So by recognizing that, we're trying to address those inequities in the system through our current legal system.
So I'm interested in kind of the utility of this specific phrasing. There could be, and lawmakers have spent, their time around this bill passage arguing that there is, plenty of policies with environmental justice impacts that don't use that exact language. So to kind of explain why we're looking for that designation, what that sort of signals about a priority area or an area of focus, I think that would be helpful to sort of frame it out before we get into what the past history of this is.
Yeah, I think that in law, generally, we write things to be specifically vague because it's important to leave interpretation, because when you're writing a law, you obviously can't anticipate all of the places in which it's going to be used. And so being specific with the environmental justice population definition is so important, because it says these communities that we have already statistically drawn out on a map because they contain large populations of people of color, large populations of folks who don't speak English as a first language, or large populations of low-income residents. These are all groups that we know statistically are affected the worst by climate change. And so if we can say in law that we know these people are more acutely affected, and we can define those groups, we can then say in law, hey, these people who are really specifically affected, more so than other people, we need to be giving them resources and attention in ways that are equitable with the rest of the Commonwealth. And so that's really the purpose of the definition, and that's the hope, is that we get it into law and it can be used to divert really necessary resources to places that aren't receiving them currently.
In the last climate justice bill in 2022, seems like a million years ago, but it was only two, there was some consideration of environmental justice communities. So, John, do you want to walk me through what did get included in that last go-round, and where at the time, because there was, of course, still critique at the time, did you see room for more improvement?
Yeah, so the real success of that bill was actually getting the definition in there. And we went back and forth with mapping experts and people looking at census data and tweaking the definition. And the definition is based on a combination of factors of whether whether it's communities of color, whether it's below a certain income level, and then whether English is spoken as a second language in the household, so language isolation. And we combine those different things, and you see the maps are multicolored. And it's sort of like if you hit the trifecta on certain characteristics. In places like Chelsea and Springfield, there are census blocks that fit all the characteristics. And then occasionally you'll find pockets that are kind of oddballs. And there are communities where there are many people of color, but they're very wealthy, high income earners, usually Indian or Chinese nationals that are here working in a lot of different fields, high tech fields and such. So the issue isn't that we're identifying these communities and automatically they get like benefits coming to them. It's we're identifying these communities so that our legal processes, our permitting processes and such can make accommodations for these communities that could be harder to reach, whether that might just be an additional notice of something in a language that's, accessible to that community, letting people like an additional ad in the local paper to make sure that they know there's a hearing about this coming up, all the way to actually having more detailed analyses for these areas. And I think that's in this go around, this legislation, the sort of 1-2 punch for EJ is one, defining those communities, and then secondly, start talking about what the cumulative impacts, the burdens that those communities are already carrying, and evaluating that in light of proposals for new activities in those communities.
So there have been some recent regulations that have addressed the concept of environmental justice communities, namely amendments to air pollution regulations that were announced in March that require certain facilities that seek air emissions permits in or near these communities have to conduct a cumulative impact analysis. So how is the Healy administration doing so far on these kind of environmental justice priority areas, and how significant was that one particular bit of regulatory change? Whichever of you feels most inclined to answer.
Well, I can just say that the Mass Department of Environmental Protection rolled out these new regulations of cumulative impact for air permits in particular. And it's very involved. They put a lot of effort into it, and we greatly appreciate it. It's great to see it. It serves as a model for other agencies to think about how they can incorporate it. We're actually in Chelsea, we're working on a project with the Environmental Protection Agency where we're bringing together both federal and state agencies to talk about how they approach cumulative impact assessments, because the federal government, or the EPA at least, is considering rolling out regulations on cumulative impact assessments. So this is coming down the pike, and little by little agencies are starting to adopt it. So actually defining what it means to do a cumulative impact assessment, what are we talking about? Defining that legally is really important for legislators, because then they don't have to keep, trying to define all these things, and the agencies don't have to try to guess what the legislators are talking about. It's defined in law, and we can just reference it. And that's one of our issues with the Senate bill, was the fact that it assiduously avoided referencing the EJ definition and just sort of redefined it again. And that just feels like a backtracking on what's already been accomplished in the past.
So thinking about that Senate bill, Rusty, John, you've both mentioned this has been kind of a long process to even get that definition in there in the first place. And so this bill, which just passed but needs House and Governor approval, so there's still some work that I'm sure you folks are doing, it does not include that environmental justice community language. So starting with kind of when you were looking through this bill to figure out what actually was included in it, was that surprising? Did you see any indication that that was going to be excluded?
I personally was surprised. I feel that in the conversations I had as a commissioner on the State Commission for Clean Energy Infrastructure Siting and Permitting, the times I've spoken to the DPU and the EEA, and all of these relationships that we maintain with legislators in the state government, I personally felt surprised, because this is environmental justice population is a word that comes out of my mouth very frequently. So I not blindsided, but perhaps a touch disappointed.
One part of the bill, I was going through it, going, to what extent did they or did they not talk about environmental justice? So it establishes that there shall be an Office of Environmental Justice and Equity within, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and it's tasked with implementing environmental justice principles. So break this down for me a little bit. Wouldn't this thing that you're looking for in concept, at least, because you can understand why it looks a little bit blurry, wouldn't this fall under that broad umbrella, or are there specifics that should have been included in this bill? Why not say this is the job of a dedicated office in the future? Why redefine it in that way?
Well, the office is already established. So there's a little bit of like sort of standing next to somebody else who's just built a nice sandcastle and then pointing to it and say, look at what I did. But I don't want to undercut what it means. What it means is actually establishing that office in legislation. So that's a pretty critical issue. Right now, it's established by the governor, and governors come and go, and that can result in changes. So it's always this balance between, do you want to put yourself through the thresher of trying to get something into legislation, or do you have an accommodating agency or administration that you can work with and you can get regulations pushed through, which is great, but those regulations can then be changed by the next governor who comes in, whether it's through the executive orders or just an order to their Secretary of Environment and Energy saying, we need to change this process, come up with new regs. So that's sort of the balance. So they do have, it's job security for the folks who are in that position, I guess. But at the same time, it's not new. It's not moving the ball forward. And in fact, the thing that we really need is that cumulative impact assessment, because that is where the rubber hits the road, and it's where we can actually distinguish between those communities that really need the assistance and those communities who may fit some of the definitions of an EJ community, but are not actually currently experiencing a high burden, environmental burden in their community.
Rusty, looked like you wanted to jump in at some point. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what John said. And I think for me and for us at Arise, one of the reasons it's so important to have this codified through legislation and not have it just be a regulation is we're seeing this on the federal level with some of the stuff that's happening at the Supreme Court, where political tides turn, and courts and lawmakers can make decisions that perhaps feel unethical or that we do not agree with. And so as a young person thinking about my future and the people who are younger than me coming through this world, I would like to know that these things are written down and are not going to change.
To build a little bit on, I don't know if crystal balling it would be the best way to put it, but what did it indicate to you when you saw this language? What might have looked like a bit of a step back? What might have looked like kind of focusing on codifying one part of this environmental justice definition, but not the community definition? How did you parse essentially the way that the Senate has been talking about the bill? They've called it reflective of a commitment to climate justice. So what does that actually read as to you?
I go back to thinking of both Rusty and I served on that governor's commission on energy infrastructure, siting and permitting reform. And there was definitely like, the end of The Hobbit where you've got the elves and the dwarves and the goblins and everybody's all there. The eagles come in. We had all the different sectors at the table. And like the legislators like to say, if I do my job right, everyone will be mad at me, because everyone's going to have to give a little. Sometimes you do your job right, everyone's mad at you, but it doesn't necessarily mean you produce good legislation either. So it's a question of trying to balance all these issues. And I think that things are a little bit out of balance. And one of the reasons why is that there is this sense of urgency on the part of people like Rusty and myself, on the part of organizations like Mass Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, on the part of the new, of economic concerns of the new clean energy companies. We have to move this stuff, as soon as possible. We're all on board with that. Clean energy is needed. This bill really does help facilitate a lot of that. The concerns that we have are very much around not repeating the mistakes that we've, accumulated in our legislation over the past 100 years when it comes to energy. And the easiest way to see those mistakes is to just come on over to Chelsea and take a stroll up the Chelsea Creek, and you can see where all the fuel is stored. All this industrial use is here. This is in communities of color, communities that have historically for over 100 years been immigrant communities. And these communities have had to bear the burden of that. And so the legislation we were really hoping to see in here wasn't so much, let's say it again, for the people in the back of the room, it's environmental justice communities, but and we codified this. That's great. But now what we need to look at is when we are doing permitting, when we are doing siting, currently through the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act, a project proponent, whether you're making a retail mall or a power plant, you have to put in an environmental impact statement. And that's sort of equivalent to saying, there's going to be a punch and it's coming from Mike Tyson or it's coming from a 100-pound weakling. What is the impact going to be? And the cumulative impact assessment really is looking at who is being punched. Are you punching Mr. T, and it's Mike Tyson? Okay, so it's an equal fight here. Or are you punching somebody who already has health impacts, who's unemployed, who lives in poor housing, who can't pay rent, all these sort of things that accumulate on a person. And they don't just accumulate on persons, but it's a cumulative burden on an entire community. And so what we were looking for was that kind of assessment to actually look at the cumulative impacts. And there was a bit of a dodge on doing the cumulative impact assessments. And some of it was, I think, a misunderstanding of just thinking that, oh, I need to do an analysis. Like, I just want to propose this one project. I have to do an analysis now of this entire community. No, it's not that. It's just to look like, is your project going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back here? Or is this community able to carry this burden and contribute to the energy economy of the Commonwealth?
I am curious when we talk about the regional sweep of climate impacts here, in reporting that I've done and reporting that a lot of wonderful people have done, there is this issue of how effective can kind of singular community-focused planning be if you understand that kind of you have a domino effect. Say if one community is dealing with sea level rise in a big way, they have to either go somewhere or work with the surrounding communities to literally shore up their areas. So could you talk a little bit about how regional and community level interests connect specifically when it comes to environmental justice policy? Because if an area is right next to an environmental justice community, can those policies impacting each other really be separated?
This might be a controversial take, but I got to talk about here in Springfield. What I have seen is you would think that, environmental justice populations next door to non-environmental justice populations, that perhaps there would be a butting of heads. But I feel like I have seen the opposite. Here in Springfield right now, we're fighting a high pressure natural gas pipeline that Eversource would like to install. Most of it is going to be in Springfield, but a portion of it will be in East Longmeadow. And I think like the solidarity and camaraderie that we have developed between the East Longmeadow resistance group and the Springfield resistance group has been really amazing to see, and not something that you might necessarily expect given how different East Longmeadow and Springfield are demographically and in other ways. And I will say I felt a lot of solidarity with places like Holyoke and Northampton as well. They're working on like complete streets initiatives. They're working on public arts initiatives. We're doing a lot of that here as well. And especially with Holyoke, another gateway city, another majority minority city, there has just been like a lot of learning going on. And I think out here in the Valley, we're also very lucky. Amherst and Northampton and Hadley have a bunch of schools in them. And so the outreach that we feel from the universities and from the young people who are grooming themselves up into young organizers and activists is really beautiful. And so I think sometimes it's hard for me to see the butting of heads because my experience has been kind of that we're all in this together, and that this legislation, although it changes the way things will be structured and where things will go, it doesn't change the fact that we're making a more equitable future, and that is good for everybody. And I think that's something that everybody can buy into when you understand what that means.
So I think you've kind of hit on a few different elements that are worth probing here before we wrap. And one of them specifically is kind of, we love an example here. So if you're trying to think about what is the way that singling out an environmental justice community definition would benefit or change a regulation or requirement, what does it mean if you say instead of all of these projects need to do an impact report, why target them at an environmental justice group? Is that kind of for economical reasons, efficiency reasons, prioritizing reasons? Why focus in specifically, practically, kind of as a matter of law, rather than say we're going to throw the biggest blanket possible?
I think it's important just because we're trying to address this historic legacy of disinvestment and the burdens that are placed on given communities. EJ discussions always have a bit of that chicken and egg thing. Are these facilities being located there because it's low income, or are low income people there because they moved into an area that was, industrial to begin with? And sometimes there's a little bit of both in there, but more frequently than not, and at least from the decisions that are present today, it has to do with, property values. You put in these things where it's cheap. And what is happening, it's actually kind of a sea change in the environmental justice movement in general, is the fact that for places like Chelsea and East Boston and Everett, what we're seeing are the industrial uses are being displaced as much as the people are, the low-income people, as gentrification and sort of land development comes into these areas. So the dynamics of this are complicated, but it's definitely needed. The idea of doing a cumulative impact, even if you were to go out to Western Mass, there are certain counties and certain towns in Western Mass that are getting all the clean energy infrastructure in terms of solar panels. And so people are getting nervous because all the trees are being cut down and you're just having one, facility after another. And there are other places where it's not happening. Now, it has obviously everything to do with who is in those communities. And so some of those might not be people of color. So one of the things that would make sense is a cumulative impact. Are we sharing the burden? We need clean energy. We need solar fields. How are we distributing that in the Commonwealth? How are we distributing this burden? Are some people having to carry more of that burden than others? More often than not, it's usually communities like Holyoke and Springfield and Lawrence and others where they are getting stuck with these kinds of facilities. But as the nature of our energy sector changes, we'll see this going into other locations where property values are lower and they can do it there and they can make the numbers work, as they say. So I think a cumulative impact assessment is a tool that not only is critical for your stereotypical EJ community in terms of being low income, being immigrant or people of color, but also for rural, poor, and other communities that are not as connected, shall we say, to be able to push back on a project they may not want. So it's not a question of NIMBYism as so much of it is how much goes in my backyard, and does anyone else have this in their backyard? Like, why can't we share this around a bit more equitably?
And it is deeply no secret that we are in crunch time right now. We're in July, less than a month before these bills have to essentially move or die. Second year of the legislative cycle is closing. So how much wiggle room do you tend to see on that tight time frame? And how are your organizations feeling about sort of being in this situation consistently? Everything sort of ends up happening in the last few months of the cycle, not only the budget, but major bills like climate, like housing, like economic development. So what does that look like from a policy pushing standpoint? And then I can only imagine it's a little bit frustrating personally, seeing this happen over and over again. So who has the strongest feelings and wants to go first?
We have a 2-year legislative cycle, and realistically speaking, 18 to 20 months of it are spent just sort of having coffee and chatting and sending around drafts of just sort of vague language and big dreams. And then you start getting down to the final couple of months and people get hot and bothered and it really gets going. And then major things start happening with, like, they come out with 24 hours to read it and you got to get your amendments in, and frantic phone calls and late night phone calls. And it just feels like this is not a way to run a railroad here. It's a disservice to their constituents. It's a disservice to everyone except for those who are able to really hire lobbyists to work full time doing this stuff. You know, we're working at educating community members, and bringing community members, it takes time, and you get them up to speed on a bill, you get them to come and give testimony, you're talking about these things to people to educate them about it. And then somebody else comes in at the last minute and they've got 4 or 5 different consultants who can just spend the next 48 hours running around the halls of Beacon Hill. And it puts us at a real disadvantage. And it just doesn't, everyone complains about it and it never really changes. But I do think it needs to be altered in some way.
Rusty, I have a little bit of a kind of final targeted question at you, because you brought up sort of the young person element of all of this earlier, which is, I think there is often sort of a process for folks as they become familiar with the legislative cycles. They see the way that this kind of ends up shaking out year over year. Is this something that ends up having an impact in your view in terms of how younger people can feel about their efficacy, their ability to sort of impact these cycles if they end up in this hamster wheel situation?
I feel a lot of ways about it. I've been in my position for 3 years now. So this is my first like full legislative cycle that I've been a part of from tip to tail.
Mazel.
Thank you. I feel like I have not personally known peace since like March. But my big takeaways have really been, I'm 23, by the way. I'm 23. If you wonder why young people don't seem motivated and are depressed and anxious and feel like the world is ending, it's because it is. And I'm coming up as somebody who, like, the last civil presidential election happened when I was 12. And so it's really frightening to be a young person. It's really frightening to be a young person trying to plan your future at all, just because it feels like it's not worth planning for. With the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis, all of the crises, it's really frightening to be a young person. And I think for me, what this has really taught me is that, like, young people, we need to get out there and vote. Not because I think any of the candidates are better than any of the other candidates. We need to go out and vote because we are voting for the people that we are fighting against. When we try to make legislation, when we try to change the status quo, we are fighting against the people that we vote for. So vote in somebody who you think is either going to play nice or that we can beat.
Thanks again to Rusty Polsgrove and John Walkey for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. Subscribe to CommonWealth's daily download if you'd like daily updates from our newsletter. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.